Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 on the Baroque Era. Today I'm going to be talking about characteristics of Baroque music and also sort of a preview of the different types of genres of music in the Baroque, of which there are many. And so we're going to want to start right from the beginning to try and organize them and keep track of them so we can keep them straight, and that'll be one of my goals for today. So, if you're following along in the Camian text, I'm at page 104, and it starts with some review. In music, the Baroque style flourished during the period from 1600 to 1750. They mention the names of some composers, and there are many, many different composers, but I'll just give you a preview of the 6 major composers that we are going to look at. Unfortunately, we just don't have time for more, but there are many, many wonderful composers during this time. Of the composers that we're going to look at, a couple of them are early Baroque, middle Baroque, and then 3 of them are late Baroque. So, first, Claudio Monteverdi, whom I mentioned a little bit in the previous lecture, is really the leading figure in the early Baroque. He is the first major important composer of opera. He didn't single-handedly invent the genre of opera, but he's the first important opera composer, the first master of opera. And since opera is so influential on all of the other genres of music of the Baroque, that's a big deal. Then we will also have, we will look at Henry Purcell, English composer. Also early Baroque. He wrote the greatest opera in the English language, Dido and Aeneas, in addition to many, many other works. Unfortunately, he died young, only about 36 years old, same age that Mozart was when he died young, in the next era that we'll get to. And we'll also look at Arcangelo Corelli, who's a mid-Baroque composer. Very significant, among other things, because he was really the first composer in history, the first major composer, to specialize in only instrumental music. Didn't really even bother with vocal music. Then we get to our 3 late Baroque composers, Antonio Vivaldi, George Frederick Handel, and J.S. Bach. So as we're organizing this material, I think it's good to sort of have separate categories, and one might be the historical background stuff, what the word Baroque means, all the things I talked about in the last lecture. Another one might be the subject of today's lecture, that is general characteristics of Baroque music, sort of an overview of the different Baroque genres, the different types of compositions which exist. And then the actual composers themselves. So there will be test questions on the lives and careers of these 6 composers, like when roughly did they live within the Baroque? Were they early, middle, or late? What nationality were they? What kinds of pieces are they best known for? What instrument did they play? What was their main instrument? Some of them played more than one, but so those are the sort of the different broad categories that you'll want to be prepared for as we anticipate a test in 2.5 weeks, something like that. Okay, so the much of the rest of this stuff on page 104 I went over last time. They talk about this division of an early, middle, and late Baroque, each one of these little sub-eras lasting roughly 40 or 50 years. Again, there's not a hard and fast division between early, middle, and late, but there is a difference over this period of time. I mentioned that one of the differences is the texture of Baroque music tends to be more homophonic the earlier you are in the Baroque, but it becomes increasingly polyphonic and complex the later we get in the Baroque. This is kind of an important point, a couple of important points regarding harmony. So it says here, to depict extreme emotions in their texts, early Baroque composers used dissonance with a new freedom. Never before were unstable chords so prominent and emphatic. Okay, so remember what dissonance is. It's basically when we have two different tones, two or more different tones that clash with each other, let's say, that create a feeling of instability or tension. And in the Renaissance, there was dissonance in Renaissance music, but it was blended in so masterfully and smoothed over that it never kind of stood out and gave you like a chill up your spine or anything. The composers had a technique which they were trained, which they learned, and there were certain ways that dissonances, like an instance of dissonance, had to be approached in a certain way and resolved in a certain way so that it didn't stand out. And there are many different ways of approaching and resolving. This is something that composers were trained to be able to do. But the idea was, yes, we need to have dissonance. The harmony will be too bland and boring without it. But it should never sound ugly. It should never stand out and sound just wrong or ugly, like a wrong note, something like that. Well, this reflects a different sort of artistic priority. So remember, I said that overall, we could really generalize and say the artistic priority of the Baroque era, whether we're talking about music or any of the other arts, the main priority is not necessarily beauty, it's expression of emotion. And sometimes these dissonances could be used to express an emotion, especially a painful emotion. So if I am Monteverdi or some other Baroque composer, and let's say I'm writing an opera, I'm writing a song of some kind, and it's a song about, so many of these love songs that we've talked about, no matter what era, it's not happily ever after love, it's heartbreak or loss or longing or whatever, right? And maybe I come to a certain word in the text of the song, like pain or grief or sadness or death or something like that. Maybe to heighten the effect of that particular word, I will make it so that the singer is maybe dissonant with whoever is providing the accompaniment, the background harmonization, right? So that you actually feel some pain, kind of, on the word pain because of that dissonance. So composers are deliberately using unprepared dissonances that they want to be heard very clearly because it helps reinforce the meaning of the words, right? And this is kind of an extension of text painting, which is an idea that we've talked about in both of our previous eras, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But what is new is the deliberate use of dissonance to drive home this emotion. And again, you're sacrificing some of this pure sense of beauty because dissonance is quote unquote ugly, right? And so what might seem ugly to a Renaissance composer, if they could see into the future and see what the composers of the Baroque were doing, what might seem ugly to them, the Baroque composer would say, no, it's expressive. I am expressing the meaning of the words so that my audience feels what I want them to feel, what my character, let's say, in an opera is feeling. Now, I'm making reference to opera because, again, opera is the trendsetter, but all of the characteristics that I talk about in relation to opera, remember that they pretty much all filter out into the many, many other genres of music, including purely instrumental music where there is no, there are no words, there is no text to express. So even in, let's say, instrumental music, this idea of unprepared dissonance or dissonance that's deliberately made to stand out is a feature. Also, speaking of harmony, the book mentions that this era was the time when our modern system of tonal harmony really comes into being. The book says, the medieval or church modes, that is, the antiquated scales that were used by medieval and Renaissance composers, the modes, as they're called. I mean, mode is just another word for scale, but we usually use the word mode to refer to these older scales, which kind of didn't make it into the Baroque era. As we get into the Baroque era, only two of the many different scales that were used in the previous eras Only two of them kind of survive this transition, the major scale and the minor scale. Now, although we have only two different scales, we have the possibility of being in many different keys using those scales. That was not the case in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. The scale was associated always, a given scale was associated with a certain tonic, a certain starting note, and you didn't like transpose those scales into other keys, right? This is what's done instead beginning in the Baroque era. You have fewer scales, but you have the possibility of transposing those scales into other keys and therefore modulating between keys. And as instruments develop more and more, remember this is the time of the rise of instrumental music. Remember I said that, I think I mentioned that Renaissance and even early Baroque instruments were not capable of playing in too many different keys because of the tuning system they used. It's kind of a complicated technical issue, but the tuning system that were used on instruments that have a fixed tuning, like a keyboard instrument or like a fretted stringed instrument, right? Depending on which intervals you want to sound in tune and which intervals you are willing to let be slightly out of tune, because you have to choose, right? Depending on which intervals you prioritize, you might limit yourself in terms of the number of different keys you can play in, because something might sound good in one key, but then sound out of tune in another key, right? During the Baroque era, we see the evolution of a system of tuning called equal temperament, which is the system that we use today, which allows you to modulate, to play in any different key. So for example, Renaissance or early Baroque keyboard players would only play in keys that have a low number of sharps or flats, right? Because if they played in a key like F sharp major, which has 6 sharps, right, it would just sound out of tune because of the way instruments were tuned. This is no longer an issue by the time we get to the end of the Baroque, and in fact, one of the major landmarks of this evolution of this new tuning system is the collection of keyboard works called The Well-Tempered Clavier by J.S. Bach, which there are actually 2 collections. There are 2 books of preludes and fugues, keyboard pieces in every major and minor key. That's something that just wouldn't have been possible in an earlier time. So our modern system of tonal harmony, our modern tuning system evolves during the Baroque, or let's say comes into being, becomes solidified, becomes established during the Baroque. Okay, the book says we will focus mainly on the late Baroque period. Now, we are going to talk about the early Baroque, actually. We're going to talk about Monteverdi, who's an early Baroque composer. We're going to talk about how opera came to be, which is something that happens in the early Baroque. But in terms of the characteristics of Baroque music, which are listed beginning at the bottom of page 104 into page 105, at least in the latest edition, the 2025 release of the Camian text, these characteristics that they are listing are, let's say, more true of the late Baroque than maybe the early Baroque, right? So they're deciding to focus on the late Baroque, probably because this is maybe the era, this is really the time when composers whose names you would know, these are the earliest composers whose names as a layperson, as someone who's maybe not necessarily into classical music, you would be familiar with. So, for example, when we were back in the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages, I doubt many of you had ever heard of Machaut, or Landini, or Josquin, or even Palestrina before you started taking my class. But you've probably heard of Vivaldi. You've certainly heard his music, maybe while you were on hold, or in a doctor's office or something like that. You've heard of Handel. You've heard the Hallelujah Chorus. You've heard bits of Messiah, which is an oratorio, for unto us a child is born, etc. And you've probably heard of J.S. Bach. You've probably heard some of his music, although you might not have realized it. So, since this later Baroque period is more familiar to us today, I think that's why the book decided to focus on that. And they're just kind of giving you a heads up that these characteristics are perhaps more true of later Baroque than earlier Baroque, but actually, I think for most of the Baroque, these characteristics which they're going to list apply. As I go through and talk about these, be conscious of what has changed from the Renaissance, right? We can really only know about a given thing in relation to other things, really, at least in terms of artistic styles, let's say, or characteristics of a given period of music. It's important to keep in mind what changed from what came before. So I'll be pointing that out on some occasions here. First thing they mention, unity of mood. A Baroque piece usually expresses one basic mood. What begins joyfully will remain joyful throughout. So this goes back to this artistic priority which I mentioned during the Baroque era, which is that the composer, the artist, the playwright, whatever it is, someone creating a work of art, their main goal is to get an emotional response, an emotional reaction, to cause an emotion in the listener or in the viewer. And the idea is, well, if we're going to do that, then we should really focus on one particular emotion at a time. We shouldn't kind of like pull our punches or send mixed messages. We should focus on one emotion so that we really get that reaction. Now, that having been said, it is possible to have contrasts of emotions if we have a multi-movement piece. Right? Now, I've already talked about the concept of the multi-movement piece back when I was talking about the Renaissance Mass, right? And in that case, it's a 5-movement work because there are 5 prayers in the ordinary of the Catholic Mass. Those 5 prayers where the texts remain the same every day in the church year, etc. So we already know about the concept of a multi-movement work. That is, we have an overall work, but it has separate movements, and those movements have their own beginning and ending. Well, we will see that many of the types of compositions, that almost all of them really, that we will talk about in the Baroque era, they are multi-movement works. So within a given movement, there will be one basic mood. And then when that movement ends, we go to a different movement of the same overall work, which may well have a contrasting mood. And then maybe another movement which has yet another mood, right? So we might begin with a happy, cheerful, energetic movement, and then maybe a slower, maybe more somber, more solemn movement, maybe, and then maybe a final movement which again goes back to the faster tempo and has an upbeat mood or maybe an agitated mood or what have you. Keep in mind that the number one thing that determines the mood really is the tempo. This goes back to our first unit on the elements of music. Remember I said how the tempo of a piece of music is the thing that more than anything else establishes what the mood will be, whether it's upbeat, whether it's slow. It's just kind of unavoidable. So we very often find that in multi-movement pieces we have contrast in tempo from one movement to the next, and this is the main way that the composer can bring about a contrast in mood. I'm still right at the bottom of page 104, and this is an important point. It says, emotional states like joy, grief, and agitation were represented. At the time, these moods were called affection. So the word for mood, what we would use to express the meaning, back then they used the word affection. So affection in this context with an A at the beginning doesn't mean like being affectionate. Affection means like affect or mood. And there was an idea or a practice that developed over the course of the Baroque called the doctrine of affections. And the doctrine just means teaching, or the theory, let's say, of affections was the idea that you could get certain emotional reactions, cause certain emotional states in your listener by using certain musical figures in a consistent way that sort of telegraph these emotions or encode these emotions, right? And enough composers did this over time that it actually kind of worked. Audiences kind of knew what they were supposed to feel based on a certain music, a purely musical thing, not really necessarily the words, but the notes. So there was like almost like a catalog of, if you want your listener to feel this, use this kind of a figure. Right? I'm just going to give one example of this because we're going to see it in one of the pieces that we look at least one of the pieces. And that is a descending scale in the bass. If we have a descending scale in the bass line of a piece of music, it's understood that we are to be thinking about death. That's how a composer kind of symbolized death. And enough composers did it over time that audiences came to understand, oh, that's what this is about. That's like my cue. If I hear that descending bass line, right, it's like descending into death or going into the grave or whatever you want, right? And so composers would use this in operas if a character was dying. J.S. Bach used it in his Mass, in the crucifixus of his Mass in B minor. There is a descending scale pattern, again, because Christ is dying on the cross, etc. So, and that is just one example of the principle, right? So the doctrine of affections isn't just the idea that a descending bass line is about death. It's about using any musical figure in this way, whether it is rhythmic, whether it has to do with a certain chord or a certain pattern of notes, to get a variety of different emotional reactions from the listener. Okay. Rhythm. Unity of mood in Baroque music is transmitted, first of all, by continuity of rhythm. Rhythmic patterns heard at the beginning of a piece are repeated throughout. Right? And it's also worth mentioning that, generally speaking, the rhythm is more in the foreground in Baroque music than it was in Renaissance music. I think back in our unit on the Renaissance, again, these are one of these things that changes, that we need to know what changed. The book mentions that in the Renaissance, rhythm was more of a gentle flow for the most part. Now, there are some exceptions to this. We looked at instrumental dance music in the Renaissance, and that obviously needs to have the rhythm kind of projected in a vigorous way so that people know when to move, when to dance. And there were some madrigals that had that element of dance-like rhythm in them, but generally speaking in the Renaissance, there's sort of a sense of just things flowing along, and there isn't like a sharply defined beat in most Renaissance music. In Baroque music, there is a sharply defined beat. Right? Now, that beat is not necessarily going to be pounded out by a percussion instrument. So just be aware, when I use the word rhythm, I sometimes fear that just the use of the word rhythm makes people instantly think of drums. No. Most Baroque music did not use percussion instruments. Percussion instruments were not like standard members of the orchestra in the Baroque era. So we're not talking about necessarily pounding the beat out on drums, but projecting the rhythm within the music in other ways, just by making it sort of more snappy, rather than just sort of serenely flowing along in the way that, for example, that Josquin motet that we listened to back in the Renaissance, or the Palestrina Mass, it's not really something that you would find yourself tapping your foot to. But Baroque music very often is music that you find yourself tapping your foot to, especially the instrumental music. Okay, so continuity of rhythm provides this unity of mood, right? Because the rhythmic motion of a piece, which is, again, sort of wrapped up in the tempo as well, that's what makes you feel more than any other single thing, whatever emotion it is the composer wants you to feel. Melody. Baroque melody also creates a feeling of continuity. What does that mean exactly? Well, very often, again, this is more true of the later Baroque era, but Baroque melodies tend to be very, very sort of continuous. They often they seem not to stop for breath. They're like run-on sentences. If you recall back when I talked about melody in the elements in our first unit, I was introducing the elements of music, and I said that melodies are very often broken up into phrases. And the phrases end with cadences, sort of like how we have sentences in language, and the sentences end with punctuation marks. And then we take a breath and we move on to our next sentence, right? Well, Baroque music, again, increasingly towards the late Baroque, we still might have phrases, but at the instant one phrase ends, another begins without really taking a breath, or maybe we don't really have. It's hard to find individual phrases at all because it's just continuous, sort of like a continuous run-on sentence. Right? And this is at least in part caused by, well, it's caused by the desire to project the rhythm and to keep the motion going, but also it's something that's really made possible by the rise of instruments, especially the bowed stringed instruments and the keyboard instruments. Because these two instruments, you don't actually need to take a breath in order to play them. I mean, you do need to breathe or you're gonna faint. But unlike singing or playing wind instruments, you don't have to stop to take a breath in order to keep going, right? Now, in the Renaissance and in the Middle Ages, remember, vocal music was king, right? And instrumental music was the sideline. And so melodies were written with the voice in mind, with the capabilities of the voice in mind. But the farther we go into the Baroque, now instrumental music is becoming more important than vocal music. That's kind of a generalization. But what I mean by that is composers are writing generally more instrumental music than vocal music. And they begin to think more in instrumental terms rather than necessarily vocal terms. Even if they are writing for the voice sometimes, they are thinking more like a keyboard player or a violinist, which, for example, J.S. Bach and George Frederick Handel, both primarily keyboard players, but they could also both play the violin. And there are places especially like in Handel, if you're familiar with Messiah, right, which you hear bits of around Christmas time. If you've ever sang in a choir and you've sang "For Unto Us a Child is Born," or if you've sang the Hallelujah chorus, it's very difficult to sing. There are all these scales and runs that just go on and on and on, like 16th notes, and it's really written. Now it's not difficult to play on a keyboard. You're just wiggling your fingers up and down on the keys, or playing it on a violin. It's fairly simple, but it's difficult to sing because it was conceived more kind of like instrumentally, and maybe not even consciously, sort of semi-subconsciously. It was conceived more in terms of what's possible on an instrument rather than what's easy for the voice, right? And so this is one of the reasons why Baroque melodies tend to be, especially in the late Baroque, long, drawn out, complex, with lots of notes, without necessarily a place to stop for a breath, very challenging to sing. Baroque, especially late Baroque music, is very challenging to sing, whereas I think we made the point in the Renaissance music is relatively easy to sing because it was written with the capabilities of the voice in mind. The composers of the Renaissance, the great composers of the Renaissance, were primarily singers, right? Remember how I mentioned Josquin was a singer in the papal choir. Now, he could probably play some instruments as well, but he was primarily a singer. When we move into the Baroque era, all of these great composers are primarily instrumentalists and not really singers. I'm sure they can sing fairly well, but that wasn't their main instrument the way it would have been more likely the case for a Renaissance or medieval composer. Okay. The book makes these same points just in a slightly different way. They also mention the idea of the sequence. I should remind you what a sequence is. I did bring this up back in the elements of music when I was talking about melody. I said that melodies often contain sequences. Sequences are simply when we take some kind of a melodic pattern, like a pitch pattern, and usually also a rhythmic pattern, and we repeat it at a higher or lower pitch level. Like you're all familiar with the Pachelbel canon. You probably heard it at weddings, right? And you get to that part in the Pachelbel canon when it's like da 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 dee da 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 dum ba da 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 dee da dee da dee da dee da 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 dee da da dum da 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 da. You can detect that there's a pattern there that basically is repeating at a higher or lower pitch level. That's essentially what a sequence is, right? And we find that all over the place in Baroque melody, and that's one of the ways that composers kind of like string these melodies along by using the idea of the sequence. Dynamics. Okay, so here is where we talk about terraced dynamics. We haven't really talked about dynamics very much since we introduced the term back in the elements unit. So dynamics are simply degrees of loudness or softness in music. And we didn't really talk about it in the medieval or the Renaissance because composers in those days did not indicate how loud or how soft you should play something. That was just kind of left to the performer to do. And the idea of having a wide variety of dynamics, it might not have even really occurred to them. If for example, if I'm in the Renaissance and I'm writing a mass, and it's for 6 voice parts, like the Palestrina Pope Marcellus Mass. If I want it louder or softer in certain places, I could just have some of the voice parts rest. I could have just 2 voices singing, and therefore it's going to be softer. And then later, when I want it to be louder, I could have all 6 people singing, or all 6 parts. Right? Well, when we get into the Baroque era, composers start paying more attention to dynamics. Again, probably some of this has to do with the rise of instrumental music. Right? Many of these instruments have simply a wider dynamic range than is possible or than is practical for the human voice. Right? So composers start indicating dynamics, and they very often will have dynamics that change suddenly from loud to soft or from soft back to loud again, rather than gradually. Right? So it is more characteristic of Baroque music to have sudden dynamic changes rather than gradual dynamic changes. So remember, like a crescendo or a decrescendo is a gradual change. And this was more difficult to accomplish in the Baroque era, primarily because the keyboard instruments of the time, the harpsichord and the organ, which formed sort of like the backbone of the instrumental ensemble, these instruments were not capable of crescendos or decrescendos. You could play louder or softer on a harpsichord or an organ, but you could only do it suddenly by pulling on one of the stops and engaging more pipes or engaging more strings, so that you went suddenly from loud to soft or back again. Right? Now, the other instruments, like the violin or the trumpet or the human voice, they can make gradual increases and decreases. They can do crescendos and decrescendos. But think about it, if the keyboard instrument is sort of like at the core of an instrumental group, or if you have a keyboard instrument accompanying a singer, if the keyboard instrument can't make gradual changes, can only make sudden changes, then there's not much point having the other instruments do it because they can't match with the keyboard, right? So this is probably one of the reasons that we have more of this terraced, and by terraced we mean different discrete levels, right? That's what a terrace is. You might have seen pictures of terraced agriculture. This is when, if we have a side of a hill, it's difficult to farm on the side of the hill. If it rains, all of your seeds run down. It's difficult to plow in the first place, but if it rains, your seeds will wash down the hill. So people would cut into the hill and make sort of steps where there used to be a slope. That's what terraced agriculture is. So similar kind of concept, terrace dynamics. We have discrete levels that change suddenly from one to the other. Also, these terrace dynamics give more vivid contrast, right? Rather than being gradual, if it's a sudden change, that again maybe appeals more to this ideal of the composer to affect your mood, right? It grabs your attention, it's more dramatic, maybe, to have a sudden change in dynamic level rather than a gradual change. But for whatever reason, terraced dynamics, that's a term to know, sudden alternation from loud to soft or vice versa, is more the standard practice in the Baroque than gradual changes. Once we get to the classical era, the next era, the piano is invented and kind of, well, it's actually invented in the late Baroque, but it doesn't really catch on until the classical period. And once that happens, then we see composers using both sudden changes in dynamic or gradual changes in dynamic. Because the piano is a touch-sensitive instrument. That's the whole reason it came into being and kind of replaced the harpsichord. Okay. Texture. We've noted that late Baroque music is predominantly polyphonic in texture. Two or more melodic lines compete for the listener's attention. Usually the soprano and bass lines are the most important. So it says here, however, not all late Baroque music was polyphonic. This leads us very well into actually the next item they discuss, chords and the basso continuo. Right? So let's talk about sort of texture in combination with chords and the basso continuo. What the heck is basso continuo? Well, first of all, I should put you on notice. We're going to have several different terms that use basso in them or bass. Okay, so there's must be some importance to the bass line in Baroque music because we have so many slightly different terms that involve some version of the word bass or basso, which is simply the Italian word for bass. One of them is basso continuo, right? So I'm just going to give a brief definition of what basso continuo is, and I'll explain more about it afterwards, because I also want to, at the same time, introduce the other terms that have bass in them. So I'm going to define them first so that we can kind of keep them distinct, and then we'll get into talking about what they actually are. So first, let's talk about basso continuo. Basso continuo is basically the rhythm section of the Baroque era. So what do we mean by rhythm section? Well, if you were to go to a performance today, you go and hear a band play, or and it doesn't really matter if it's a rock band, if it's a jazz band, or a country band, or whatever. We have this thing called the rhythm section, which is basically the drummer, the bass player, and maybe a keyboard player if they have one, or maybe a rhythm guitar player. And the job of that rhythm section is, first of all, to provide a beat, in the case of the drummer, to provide a bass line, in the case of the bass player, it's sort of like the foundation, and to provide chords, right? And that's what the keyboard player is doing, or maybe a rhythm guitarist. He's not playing leads, he's not playing the melody, he's just playing chords. So all of that is accompaniment, right? It's in a supporting role. It's not meant to be the main thing that you're supposed to listen to, but it's providing the foundation, right? We have something very similar in the Baroque era. Now, we're not going to have the drums most likely. Again, drums were not a standard feature in an instrumental ensemble, but the bass line and the keyboards were. So anytime you had a group of musicians playing together in the Baroque era, whether it was purely instrumental music or if it was vocal music even, because the vocal music of this time, remember, is usually not a cappella. It's voices and instruments together. So we're going to have some instruments accompanying the singers. And the core of that instrumental ensemble, no matter how many people are playing, there's a core. There's a rhythm section consisting of somebody playing the bass line on some melodic instrument that has a low range, like a cello, or maybe the pedals of an organ, right? or maybe a bassoon, and somebody playing chords on an instrument that is capable of chords, like maybe the organ, the harpsichord, possibly even the lute, right? So, basso continuo is the rhythm section of the Baroque era, consisting of bass line plus chords, right? Next term involving the word bass is figured bass, right? Now, they talk about figured bass a little bit later. They don't talk about it right here, but I'm going to talk about it right here because, again, I want to present these three terms that have the word bass in them so that we can kind of keep them distinct from each other right off the bat. Figured bass is a way of writing music. It is a simplified form of music notation. So what it consists of are bass notes, that's the bass part. So just the bass notes are written, but then there are little figures, that is numbers or symbols, which tell the performer what kind of chord they should play above that bass note. Why should we have a whole, why don't they just write the chord, you know? Well, actually, we have something similar to figured bass today. If you are a jazz musician, or if you even have some, not necessarily jazz, but pop books, if you go to a music store and you open a book, a music book, sometimes the melody is written out, but then underneath it are just chord symbols. It'll say something like G7 or F minus 7 flat 9 or something like this. That's not exactly the same thing as figured bass, but it's the same idea. It's an abbreviated way of telling you what kind of a chord you should play under the melody, right? For the composer of the Baroque era, it offered several advantages. First of all, it saved time, it saved paper, it saved ink, but also the composer didn't feel it necessarily all that important to tell the keyboard player, the one who's playing the chords, exactly what every single note they should play. They just said, oh, if you know what this chord is, if I write this symbol and you understand what kind of chord to play, just play that chord, you know. And also there was an element of improvisation involved. Again, just as there is in modern day jazz or pop. Like, here is the chord, but you can kind of use whatever pattern within that chord. You can play the notes up in a higher octave or a lower octave. You could have some kind of rhythmic figure in there, as long as you are covering the notes of this basic chord, because that's what's going to support the melodic line. What's most important in the Baroque era is the melodic line, obviously, and the bass line, right? The melodic line and the bass line form a kind of counterpoint to each other. So this gets back to texture, right? Melodic line and bass line are most important, and especially in the earlier Baroque, what's in the middle it's important, but it's not so important that I need to tell the keyboard player exactly which note to play exactly when. As long as they are a well-trained keyboard player and they know how to read figured bass, which every keyboard player at that time knew how to read. If they were going to try and, if they wanted to get work, they needed to know how to read figured bass. And they would just look at that symbol and know, okay, yeah, I'm going to play an F major chord, here I'm going to play an A minor chord, whatever, right? So, by writing out just the bass line, right, and combining the notes of that bass line with certain symbols, or even if there are no symbols there at all, that also has a certain meaning. Right. I'm not going to get into teaching you how figured bass works beyond that. That's all you need to know. It's that it's an abbreviated, a simplified system of writing music consisting of bass notes and numbers or symbols of various kinds that indicate what kind of chord the keyboard player should play. So, the people in the basso continuo section, right, whoever is playing the bass line, and whoever especially is playing the chords, what they are looking at on the page is figured bass. Right? So that's how those two come together, basso continuo and figured bass. Although they're not the same thing, they are obviously related to each other. The last term, which has bass or basso in it, is ground bass, or I'm not sure if they use a different term for it in here. A ground bass, which they talk about in the context of Henry Purcell. It's over on page 125 is where they use the word ground bass. The other term for it is basso ostinato. So ground bass, basso ostinato, they mean the exact same thing, right? And what they mean is if you have a bass line that has some kind of repeated pattern over and over again, this is called basso ostinato or ground bass. Right? Now, it's like in fact, many pop songs have a bass line that repeats over and over again. It's just a very common feature. The word ostinato is simply Italian for obstinate, right, or stubborn. So in Italian, it's like a stubborn bass. It's simply repeating the same figure over and over and over again. Right. Now, don't confuse this with basso continuo. You might think, oh, continuo, that means repeated over and over again. No. Basso continuo, it is, obviously the word, it's continuous throughout any piece of music that we will have a bass line and chords, but it refers to the rhythm section of a Baroque ensemble. A basso continuo, like the people providing the bass line and the chords, they may or may not be playing an ostinato pattern. It may be that the music that they're looking at has a pattern that repeats over and over again, in which case they are playing a basso ostinato, but it might not be a pattern that repeats over and over again, right? It's an optional thing that composers sometimes do, and we'll see an example of it when we get to Purcell. In English, it's sometimes called ground bass. In Italian, basso ostinato, but they mean the same thing. Simply a repeated pattern in the bass line. Right. Okay, so keep those three terms in mind. Keep them separate. If you have questions about them, please let me know. And let's talk about the Baroque orchestra, the next thing that the book talks about. Notice we have never talked about the Renaissance orchestra because there was no such thing, right? An orchestra, in our understanding of the term, is sort of a standardized ensemble. It's not just like, well, bring whatever instrument you got and we'll all jam. It's, we have such and such numbers of this instrument, such and such of some other instrument, etc. Right? And in the Baroque era, this is the beginning of the orchestra, the beginning of this standard ensemble. It starts out very, very small. Right? It's not like the modern orchestra, which has 100 instruments, has all these brass and percussion and winds and etc., and has harps. No. The Baroque orchestra is just the bowed-stringed instruments, right? Violin, viola, cello, maybe a bass, right? And the bass, the upright bass, is usually just playing the same notes as the cello, but an octave lower. So just the bowed-stringed instruments, plus you need a keyboard player, probably a harpsichordist, to play the chords in the basso continuo, right? And that's all there is, right? So Baroque orchestral music is generally just, you can hear the strings. The harpsichord in the background, the chords of the basso continuo, you might hear this sort of gentle tinkling kind of sound in the background. That's the harpsichord. It's usually not in the forefront. You might not even necessarily be aware of it, but it's back there. Now, it is possible to have, let's say, if you feel like, if you're a composer and you're writing a piece for orchestra and you feel like, you know what this needs is a little bit of trumpet, or it needs a flute. I think I'll include a flute. You could do that, but that was kind of like a la carte. That was something you were adding to the standard ensemble, right? Maybe there was a certain specific musical reason for it. Maybe you were composing a piece that, I'm imagining that this movement of this piece, it's depicting a hunting scene. So I need a trumpet because it's like the hunter's horn. And that way people will hear it and they'll understand what the scene that I'm trying to describe, right? So that might be a reason you would decide to introduce some other instrument. But the core instruments, the standard instruments, were just the different members of the violin family and a keyboard instrument, probably the harpsichord, to play the chords of the basso continuo part. Right? Only when we get into the later classical era and then the Romantic era does the orchestra branch out and start to include as standard members the various wind instruments, the brass instruments, the percussion instruments. Right? So an early orchestra might only be, and you can still see this today if you go to a Baroque chamber orchestra concert where they are trying to maintain, the correct, historically correct performance practices. There might be only a dozen people on stage, and that's the orchestra. There, a maximum maybe 2 dozen, right? The Baroque orchestra just doesn't really get any bigger than that. Now you can play the music of Bach or Handel with a modern orchestra, and some composers have made arrangements where they take what Bach had written for a smaller orchestra and they figure out ways to include the other instruments, and they make an arrangement for a larger orchestra. But that would not be considered like period correct, historically correct. If you want to hear it the way Bach actually heard it, you have to do with the smaller orchestra with only those instruments that he specified. Okay, Baroque forms. Now, what I'm going to talk about just in the last few minutes here is I'm going to give you an overview of really genres rather than forms. Remember, form and genre are really 2 different things. Right? Form is the way something is built, how it is constructed. And in music, that means the arrangements of different sections to provide either continuity or variety, right? And when I talked about form back in the Elements, I said, and when I distinguished it from genre, the idea of form versus genre, I said, think of the arch in architecture. That's where we get the word architecture, is from the arch. The arch is a useful shape. It's very strong, and therefore it can be used in many different contexts. We can create a bridge with an arch or with a series of arches. We can create an aqueduct. We can create a doorway. We can turn the arch kind of on its side and make a dam, and the strength of the arch holds back the water, right? So there are many different genres of structure that use the form of the arch, right? We could build a church that has an arch, but that's a different genre than a bridge. It has a different purpose, let's say, right? So when we're talking about genres, we're talking in music about different types of compositions that have different titles, let's say, and also have different purposes. And again, I would remind you to be, as you're listening to a piece of music, keep in mind what genre it is. Say, I am listening to a concerto. I am listening to a fugue. You're not listening to just a song, right? Unfortunately, again, for lay people, every piece of music they hear, like, it's a song. That's just their standard word that they use, like song, song, song. Everything is a song. No, not every type of musical composition is a song, right? Some of them are, but most of the types of pieces that we will study in the Baroque are not songs at all, for the main reason that they are not being sung by a singer. Within the classical world, we almost always use the word song only to describe a certain type of vocal piece that involves a singer. And not all vocal pieces are songs either. We wouldn't use the word song for certain types of vocal compositions just because somebody is singing. A song is a specific thing within the classical world. So be aware of this, because again, if you're let's say you're taking your listening questions and you're thinking of everything as songs, like, oh, what's this song? No, say, this is the concerto, or this is the trio sonata, or this is a fugue, or what have you, or this is a movement from an oratorio, or this is a movement from a cantata, right? So use the correct terminology, and I think that'll give you a better handle on these many, many different genres, right? And it'll help you from getting them mixed up with each other. So the way to organize the different genres in the Baroque era, I would take a piece of paper and I would create 2 large columns, right? And down the one column, this is going to be instrumental music, and this one over here is going to be vocal music. Notice the distinction. It's a more useful distinction now that we're in the Baroque era to talk of a distinction between instrumental and vocal rather than sacred and secular, which was the main type of division this categorization that we used in the Renaissance and in the Middle Ages. Now, I think a more useful way to start breaking them down is instrumental versus vocal. Now, on the vocal side, we should keep in mind all of the different types of vocal music that we will look at are not purely vocal. They are not a cappella. They're really voices and instruments together. All right. So, over here, while I'm over here on the vocal side, voices and instruments together, there are three genres on this side which we will talk about over the course of the next several lectures. Opera, oratorio, and cantata. Right. I'm not going to go into the details of what they are. I just want you to be aware of them. Right? Opera, oratorio, and cantata, and we'll talk about those. Over here on the instrumental side, we would want to break it down into three subcategories. We have pieces for a large group of instruments, the orchestra. Right? We have pieces for a small group of instruments, which we call chamber music. That's the term that we use in the classical world for any kind of a composition for a small group of instruments, chamber music, because it's meant to be performed in a smaller room, a chamber rather than a big concert hall. And then we have types of pieces which are generally for a solo instrument. So, three sort of subcategories under instrumental for large ensemble, orchestral music, small ensemble, chamber music, and then solo. Now, there is some overlap between these. There's the possibility of overlap, but it's still a very good breakdown to use. Let's start with large ensemble, music for orchestra. The main orchestral genres of the Baroque era are the solo concerto, the concerto grosso, and the orchestral suite. I'll talk about what those are but I just want you to be aware of them, and so that you can plug them in, and we'll fill in the details on these later. But again, the main orchestral genres: the solo concerto, the concerto grosso, and the orchestral suite. Under chamber music, the main type, the only type that we're really going to talk about is something called the trio sonata. And you might think, oh, trio sonata, there must be three people playing. Unfortunately, no, there is four. Four people in a trio sonata. That's the only detail I'm going to give you for now about it. I'll talk more about it later. But the reason a trio sonata has four people is because there are two melodic instruments plus basso continuo. There are three different parts written in the music, but remember that basso continuo part is generally played by two people. One person is playing the bass line, probably on a cello, maybe on a bassoon, and the other person is playing the chords on a keyboard instrument. So generally speaking, although there are three layers written in the music, that lowest layer, it's the basso continuo part. It's written in figured bass, and we need two people to play it in most circumstances. One person could play it on an organ, right? You could play the chords with your hands and the bass line with your feet. But in practice, usually the basso continuo was two people. Therefore, a trio sonata requires four people. Okay, then we have works for solo instruments. And there are many of these. I'm just going to list a few of them that we will focus on. And by a solo instrument, we could be talking about a keyboard, a violin, could possibly be like a flute or some other instrument, but the most important instruments of the Baroque era were the violin and the other members of the violin family, but the violin is the main one, and the keyboard instruments, right? So most of the great composers of the Baroque were either violin players or keyboard players or both. Right? So these are genres that maybe we would associate mostly with the stringed instruments and with the keyboard. So here are some titles of works that are more often than not for a solo instrument. The Suite, S-U-I-T-E, like a suite of rooms or a suit of clothes. And we call it a suite because it's a multi-movement piece, right? There are different movements that make up the suite. The Prelude, the Fugue, and the Sonata, right? I don't think we're going to get into too many other types of genres besides those, but the Toccata. So let's say 5 different. There are many more, but let's focus on just 5 and just list them out. What did I say? The Prelude, the Fugue, the Suite, S-U-I-T-E, the Sonata, and the Toccata. Right. I'll talk about each of those in upcoming lectures, features and technical terms and whatever, but I just wanted to lay it out for you for now. I'm out of time, so I'll see you next time.